Good evening, dear friends, and welcome to Watson's Margins. Edward here, your quiet companion for an evening of reason and reflection. Tell me, is there a lamp lit near you tonight? Perhaps a cup of something warm, the faint sound of rain against glass, the particular stillness that invites the mind to settle and observe. These are the hours Watson understood best, ink drying on the page, the world grown hushed, and in that hush, the slow emergence of truth. Do subscribe, so you never miss a chapter in the margins. Now draw your chair a little closer, for as Holmes believed, one must first learn to see before one can ever hope to understand. Chapter 1. The Orderly House in Bloomsbury. It is a peculiarity of my long association with Mr. Sherlock Holmes that the most singular cases have arrived not in the manner of thunderclaps, but with the quiet insistence of a hand upon a door. So it was on that grey October afternoon in the autumn of 1895, when Baker Street lay wrapped in the particular melancholy that belongs to London at the close of summer, and Holmes sat in his armchair in a state of restless inactivity, his long fingers drumming a faint tattoo upon the armrest, his grey eyes fixed upon the ceiling with the vacant intensity of a man whose mind is very far from idle. I had been reading by the fire, or attempting to, for Holmes's silences were never quite silent enough to permit concentration. The afternoon post had yielded nothing of interest. The streets below were muffled in a fine autumnal mist, and Mrs. Hudson had brought up tea, which cooled untouched upon the tray. "You're going to tell me," said Holmes, without shifting his gaze from the ceiling, "that you have been attempting to read the same paragraph for the better part of 20 minutes. "I confess it," said I, setting aside my volume. "You're not precisely restful company this afternoon." "Nor shall I be," he replied, rising abruptly and moving to the window, "until London furnishes something worthy of one's faculties. There is a brougham drawn up below, Watson. It has been there these 4 minutes. The horse is a good one, the livery plain, and the gentleman within has twice raised the window blind and twice lowered it, which suggests a man rehearsing a speech he is not entirely certain he wishes to deliver." I joined him at the window. The carriage he described stood indeed in the street below, of handsome but unpretentious appointment. Even as we watched, the door opened and a gentleman descended, pausing for a moment upon the pavement in the attitude of one gathering himself. "He is prosperous," said Holmes quietly. "His coat is pool, or I am very much mistaken. He carries himself with the assurance of a man accustomed to command a room, yet his left hand grips his hat rather more firmly than the weather requires. He is anxious, Watson, and anxious men of standing do not present themselves at Baker Street without compelling reason." I observed, as the gentleman raised his eyes toward our window, that he was perhaps 60 years of age, with a broad, well-shaven face, silver hair brushed with care, and the upright bearing of a man who had kept himself in good order. His expression, even at that distance, was one of cultivated composure, but Holmes was right. There was something beneath it, some tautness about the mouth. That composure alone does not produce. Within minutes, Mrs. Hudson had announced Mr. Alistair Montague, and the man himself stood in our sitting-room. He was, as I had supposed, well appointed in every particular. His gloves were of excellent quality, his boots freshly polished, and his watch-chain bore a seal that I later learned was that of Gray's Inn. He greeted Holmes with the measured courtesy of one unaccustomed to requiring assistance, and accepted the chair offered him with the slight stiffness of a man in whom dignity and unease are presently at war. "Mr. Holmes," he began, setting his hat upon his knee, "I am not, by temperament or by profession, a man who brings his private concerns before strangers. I am a solicitor of some standing, and I have spent the greater part of 40 years in the confident application of reason to human difficulty. What has brought me here this afternoon is a matter which resists, I confess, my own considerable application of that faculty." "Then you're in the right place," said Holmes pleasantly, leaning back in his chair and pressing his fingertips together. "Pray proceed, Mr. Montague. You will forgive me if I observe that you slept poorly last night, and that the matter has been upon your mind considerably longer than last night alone." Montague looked at him with the measured surprise of a man who does not permit himself the luxury of open astonishment. "You are perceptive, sir," he said after a moment. "I have not slept with any real ease for some weeks." "Since the anniversary, I should imagine," said Holmes. Montague was still for a moment. Then he reached into the breast pocket of his coat and produced an envelope, which he placed upon the table between them with a deliberateness that struck me as almost ceremonial. It was a striking object in its way. The envelope was of good quality, its flap sealed with black wax, the wax smooth and uncrested. The direction upon the front was written in a firm, unadorned hand. There were no other marks upon it. "This is the most recent," said Montague. "It arrived 3 days ago, delivered by hand, as its predecessors have been for the past 11 years. Each arrives upon the 14th of October. Each is sealed in precisely this fashion. Each contains, upon opening, a single sheet of blank paper. No message, no demand, no signature. Nothing whatever." Holmes had taken up the envelope and was examining it with the close attention he devoted to all things material. He turned it in his long fingers, raised it briefly toward the lamp, and then held it near his face and inhaled with a deliberateness that made Montague stiffen. "You detect something," said Montague. "Bitter almonds," said Holmes, setting the envelope down with care. "Faint, but unmistakable. Pray tell me of the lawsuit." The colour, which had not been high in Montague's face, receded further. He recovered himself with the discipline of a practised man. "I was not aware that I had mentioned any lawsuit, Mr. Holmes." "You had not," said Holmes equably, "but an act repeated annually upon a fixed date, sustained over more than a decade, and attended by the symbolism of black wax and blank paper, is not the work of a random malcontent. It is the work of someone marking an occasion. A legal anniversary seemed the most probable explanation for a solicitor of your standing. The precision of the gesture suggests a grievance at once personal and historical." "But do go on." Montague looked into the fire for a moment. When he spoke again, his voice was composed, though it had lost some of its earlier assurance. 20 years ago," he said, "I represented the interests of a property company in a matter of considerable complexity. The opposing party was a man named Whitfield, a surveyor of modest means but genuine integrity, who contended that certain deeds had been improperly assigned to my client's advantage. The case occupied the better part of 2 years. My client prevailed. Whitfield was ruined. He died, I am told, within 5 years of the verdict, having lost not merely the litigation but his practice, his savings, and a great deal besides." He paused. "I have not been entirely comfortable upon the subject ever since." There was a silence of some duration. Holmes gazed at the envelope upon the table with an expression that was thoughtful rather than sympathetic, though I have known him to feel more than he showed. "And you have no suspicion," said he at last, "as to who sends these envelopes?" "None that I can substantiate." "Yet you have suspicions that you cannot substantiate," said Holmes pleasantly. Montague smiled with some difficulty. "You are a most exact man, Mr. Holmes." "It is, I find, the safest variety," said Holmes. He rose from his chair and moved to the mantelpiece, where he stood for a moment with his back to us. The odour of bitter almonds upon a blank document is not in itself a threat. It may be a warning, it may be a taunt, it may be something considerably more purposeful." He turned. "I should like to visit your household this evening, Mr. Montague, if you will permit it. Not to interrogate and not to alarm, merely to observe." Montague inclined his head in assent, and I fancied that beneath his composed exterior there was something very like relief. When he had gone, I turned to Holmes, who had retrieved the envelope once more and was studying it with half-closed eyes. "What do you make of it?" I asked. "Several things," said Holmes, "of which I am at present certain only of one. The man who sat in that chair is not entirely the victim he presents himself to be, Watson. He's a man who has carried guilt with the careful efficiency of one who has learned to store such things in a locked cabinet, rather than attend to them. The black seal troubles him more than he has admitted, and the odour of almonds troubles him most of all." He set the envelope down. "We shall see why this evening." He said no more and returned to his chair, his fingertips together and his eyes once more upon the ceiling, where, I had long since concluded, he kept a great deal of what the rest of us might call thought. Chapter 2. The Household Without Suspicion. The brougham that conveyed us to Bloomsbury that evening moved through streets already thickening with fog, the gas lamps reduced to pale aureoles in the October dark. Holmes sat opposite me, his coat collar turned up and his hands thrust deep into his pockets, in the attitude of a man who has temporarily suspended thought in favour of observation. He said very little during the journey, which suited me well enough, for I was occupied in turning over the morning's peculiar interview, and could make no satisfying arrangement of its parts. Montague's townhouse stood in a quiet crescent off Russell Square, one of those solid, well-maintained residences that convey, without ostentation, the settled prosperity of their occupants. The steps were freshly swept, the brass fittings gleamed, a light burned in the first-floor drawing-room, and another dimmer behind the curtains of the study to the right of the entrance. It was, in all outward appearance, a house of perfect order. We were admitted by a manservant of the composed and economical variety, and shown at once into the drawing-room, where Montague stood to receive us with that same studied composure he had displayed in Baker Street. The room itself was handsomely furnished, its walls lined with law books and a modest selection of literary volumes, its fire burning with an almost excessive cheerfulness. "Gentlemen," said Montague, "allow me to present the members of my household, who are assembled here at my request, and with, I must say, admirable patience." There was the faintest suggestion in his tone of a chairman opening a meeting he would rather not be conducting. I shall describe them as they appeared to me that first evening, for Watson the physician cannot entirely suppress the habit of reading persons as he might read symptoms, and first impressions, however unreliable in diagnosis, are rarely without information. The Eleanor Montague sat nearest the fire in a chair whose high back gave her an almost architectural quality. She was a handsome woman of 55 or so, with silver-streaked dark hair dressed with great precision, and hands that lay folded in her lap with a stillness that suggested long practice. Her eyes were composed, her expression pleasant, and she welcomed us with a graciousness that was genuine enough, yet seemed, if I may so describe it, professionally deployed. She was a woman accustomed to presenting a face to the world, and she presented it with considerable skill. Beside her, standing rather than sitting, was Mr. Frederick Hale, introduced as Montague's former partner at law. He was a thick-set man of 60, with a red face and the slightly deliberate movements of one who has learned to moderate a naturally impatient temperament. His handshake was firm to the point of emphasis. He struck me as a man who had held opinions strongly all his life, and was not inclined to alter the habit in old age. Miss Clara Whitfield occupied a chair somewhat apart from the others, near the writing table that stood against the inner wall. She was perhaps 30, slight in figure, with a quality of contained attentiveness that I associate with persons who have learned to observe without appearing to do so. Her face was fine-featured and pale, her dark eyes steady. She had the manner of a woman who has subordinated a considerable native intelligence to the requirements of her position, and does so without resentment, or at any rate without visible resentment. Finally, there was Mr. Edwin Bryce, the cousin, who stood at the mantelpiece with a glass of sherry and an air of amiable irrelevance. He was perhaps 40, well dressed in a slightly excessive fashion, with a mobile, good-humoured face, and the ease of a man to whom social situations present no difficulty whatsoever. He greeted us as though we were welcome additions to a dinner party. Holmes said very little during the introductions. He occupied the chair he was offered, declined sherry, and surveyed the room with the expression of mild interest that I have come to recognise as his most industrious. He asked no direct questions during the first portion of the evening. He spoke, when he spoke at all, of general matters, the autumn weather, a recent decision in the courts, the particular difficulty of maintaining a kitchen garden in London. He was, to all appearances, a man making polite conversation. Yet I observed, as I have long learned to observe, where his attention actually rested. He noted the writing table where Miss Whitfield sat and the position of its drawers. He glanced briefly but deliberately at the grate, in which a good fire was burning, and at the coal scuttle beside it. He remarked upon a watercolour above the mantelpiece, drawing Bryce into a discussion that allowed him to stand and examine the mantelpiece itself from a range of 3 feet. It was Montague who eventually brought the conversation to the matter at hand, doing so with a directness that I suspected was partly nerves reassembling themselves as resolution. "Mr. Holmes and Dr. Watson are here at my invitation," he said, addressing the room. "You're all aware of the envelopes. I have decided, after some years of treating the matter as a private nuisance, that it may benefit from a more rigorous examination." Hale made a sound that was not quite a harumph. "I have always said it was some mischief-maker who learned something of the Whitfield business and decided to make capital of it. There is no end of such people." "You may be right," said Holmes pleasantly. "Mr. Hale, you were Mr. Montague's partner at the time of the case in question." "Junior partner," said Hale, with the slight correction of a man precise about precedence. "I was opposed to certain aspects of the strategy. I said so at the time. Montague was the senior man, and the decision was his." Something shifted very slightly in the room. It was not dramatic, or it would have been imperceptible to anyone not attending closely. Miss Whitfield's hands, which had rested upon her notebook, were still. Mrs. Montague's pleasant expression did not change, but her eyes moved briefly to her husband and then away. "The strategy prevailed, at any rate," said Montague, with a flatness that suggested this was a well-worn exchange between the two men. Holmes turned to Miss Whitfield with the easy conversational pivot of a man pursuing no particular line. "You have been with the household long, Miss Whitfield?" 3 years this November, Mr. Holmes," she said. Her voice was measured and pleasant. "And before that, I was with a firm of accountants in Chancery Lane. Before that, a legal practice in Bristol." She paused. "And I have always worked in offices of a legal character." "A decided preference," said Holmes with a smile. "The law is an exacting profession to work within, even at one remove." "Exacting," she agreed, "and occasionally instructive." It was a curious word, and Holmes did not pursue it, though I saw that he noted it. Bryce, who had been following the exchange with the bright-eyed attention of a man at a tennis match, leaned forward. "Mr. Holmes, I wonder if I might ask, since we are being candid, what you actually expect to discover. 11 years of envelopes, and not a soul has come forward, not a demand has been made. If someone wished Cousin Alistair genuine harm, they have had ample time and occasion." "Genuine harm takes many forms," said Holmes. "Not all of them require action. Some are most effectively administered through patience." Bryce sat back, his expression shifting imperceptibly from amiability to something more guarded, though he recovered his smile with admirable speed. We did not remain much past 9 o'clock. Holmes declined Montague's offer of a tour of the study and the correspondence files, saying only that he might return the following morning if convenient. On the step, as the manservant retrieved our coats, Holmes paused to examine the iron boot scraper beside the door with a thoroughness entirely disproportionate to its interest as a domestic object. In the carriage returning to Baker Street I waited. Holmes was not a man to be prompted when he was in the act of arranging. "Well," I said at last as we crossed into Marylebone. "An atmosphere too harmonious," said Holmes, without preamble. "Did you notice it? They have lived with this secret long enough to have assigned one another parts. Hale is the plain-spoken dissenter, which absolves him of complicity. Mrs. Montague is the dignified wife, which places her above suspicion. Bryce is the cheerful irrelevance, which makes him easy to overlook." He was quiet for a moment. "And Miss Whitfield is loyal, conspicuously, carefully loyal. And Montague himself?" Holmes turned to look at the passing street. "Montague," he said, "is a man who's been waiting for something. I'm not yet certain whether he fears its arrival, or in some complex fashion desires it." I had no ready answer for that, and we completed the journey in silence. but I confess that as I lay that night listening to the city settle into its fitful dark, I found myself returning to Miss Whitfield's measured voice and her single deliberate word, instructive. It is, I reflected, not the word that loyalty alone would choose. Chapter 3. The envelope delivered. I had not been long at breakfast the following morning when Holmes appeared in the doorway of the sitting room, already dressed and in possession of his pipe, which he had evidently been smoking for some time. There was about him the particular alertness of a man who has slept briefly but well, his mind having resolved something during the night that had resisted resolution during the day. "Eat quickly, Watson," said he, dropping into his chair and taking up the morning paper with the air of a man who does not intend to read it. "We shall be wanted in Bloomsbury before long. You expect news?" "I expect a telegram," he said, and had scarcely finished the sentence when Mrs. Hudson's step was heard upon the stair. The message was brief, and Holmes passed it to me without comment. It was from Montague's manservant, a man named Perkins, and it read, "Mr. Montague found dead in his study this morning. Inspector Lestrade has been sent for. Please come at once." We arrived in Russell Square to find the Crescent already touched by that particular quality of stillness which descends upon a house when something irrevocable has occurred within it. 2 constables stood at the door. A small group of neighbours had gathered at a respectful distance across the street, as Londoners will when the machinery of an official calamity is visibly in motion. Lestrade met us in the entrance hall. His quick ferret's face arranged in an expression that managed simultaneously to convey gravity and satisfaction, for Lestrade was never entirely displeased to have a case of sufficient weight to justify the attendance of Sherlock Holmes. "Morning, Mr. Holmes, Doctor," said he. "Ugly business. The man's in his study. Looks like poisoning, and there's the envelope on the desk, open just as you might expect. Perkins found him at 7:30 when he came in with the morning post. Been dead an hour or 2 by then, I'd estimate, though the doctor will tell us more precisely." The study was a room of considerable character, its walls lined with legal volumes and deed boxes, its central desk a broad mahogany affair that had clearly served its owner as the command post of a working life. Montague sat behind it still. In the high-backed leather chair I imagined had been his habitual place, and the posture was so nearly that of a man engaged in quiet reading that for a moment the reality of the scene required a deliberate act of comprehension. He was dressed, which argued that he had come down early of his own volition rather than been disturbed from sleep. His hands lay open upon the desk. His face wore an expression that I can only describe as one of arrested attention, as though the last thing he had encountered had been not pain but revelation. Before him lay the black-sealed envelope, opened cleanly along its upper edge, and beside it a sheet of white paper, apparently blank, and a glass of port. The glass shattered at the stem, the wine spread in a dark stain across the green leather of the desk surface. I made my examination while Holmes moved about the periphery of the room in that unhurried, almost ruminative fashion that I have long since ceased to mistake for aimlessness. The decanter of port stood upon the sideboard, its stopper in place and fitted snugly, as though it had not been disturbed in the course of the evening. The fire in the grate had burned to ash. A single candle on the desk had guttered out, its wax pooled and set. "Cyanide," I said, straightening from my examination. "The odour is unmistakable at close quarters. Death would have been rapid. I should place the time between 5:30 and 6:30 this morning." "There you see," said Lestrade with the air of a man confirming what he had already decided. "The envelope arrives. The man reads what's inside, and the guilt of 20 years is too much. He'd had the cyanide in his cabinet, apparently. We found the bottle." Holmes, who had been examining the window frame with his lens, turned at this. The cabinet was locked. It was, and the key was in his waistcoat pocket. "And the decanter stopper, Lestrade, was it in position when you arrived?" Lestrade blinked. "It was, yes, as you see it." "Quite so," said Holmes, and said nothing further on the point, returning his attention to the window, which stood fractionally open, admitting a thin blade of cold October air. He examined the latch, the sill, and the outer ledge with the lens, then straightened and crossed to the desk. He did not touch the envelope or the paper. He leaned over them with his hands clasped behind his back at a distance of perhaps 8 inches, and remained in that position for nearly a minute. Then he stood and looked at the shattered glass. "A man who intends to poison himself with cyanide dissolved in port," he said, in the conversational tone he used when thinking aloud, "does not cork the decanter after pouring his final glass. The act implies an intention to preserve the remainder, which is precisely the concern that suicides have abandoned." "Perhaps he did it from habit," said Lestrade. "Perhaps," said Holmes, in a tone that assigned the suggestion its precise weight. By this time the household had assembled in the drawing-room, shepherded there by a second constable with the practised gentleness of the Metropolitan Police dealing with the recently bereaved. I joined them briefly while Holmes continued his examination of the study. Mrs. Montague sat in her habitual chair by the fire, a posture which must have required considerable determination given the circumstances, and which I read as the self-discipline of a woman who has decided that composure is the form her grief will take. Miss Whitfield sat beside her, pale and very still. Hale stood at the window with his hands behind his back, staring into the crescent below. Bryce occupied the sofa, leaning forward with his elbows upon his knees, turning his signet ring repeatedly with the absent motion of a man whose thoughts are moving rapidly in a direction he has not yet determined. Each member of the household accounted, upon gentle questioning, for the hours between 10 o'clock the previous evening and the discovery of the body. Mrs. Montague had retired at 10 and had not descended until Perkins raised the alarm. Hale, who occupied the guest room on the second floor, had heard nothing, and had similarly remained above until morning. Miss Whitfield had worked late in the room she used as an office, adjacent to the library, and had gone up shortly before midnight. Bryce had been out until 11 at his club, had let himself in with his key, and had gone directly to bed. Every account was delivered calmly, and with a particularity of detail, names of servants seen, sounds heard, times observed, that struck me, even as I listened, as slightly too exact in the manner of testimony that has been, not fabricated precisely, but rehearsed against the possibility of being required. Holmes emerged from the study some 40 minutes after we had arrived, and I read in the set of his jaw and the brightness of his eyes the signs of a man who has found what he was not certain he would find, or rather, what he had suspected he would find, and very much hoped he would not. "Lestrade," said he, pausing in the doorway of the drawing-room, "you will not close the study. Nothing is to be removed." "The body must be taken," said Lestrade, reasonably enough. "The body, yes. Nothing else." He surveyed the assembled household with a glance of comprehensive mildness. "I am sorry for your loss. I hope you will all remain in the house and available to speak with me over the coming days. The matter," he added, his voice carrying no particular emphasis, "is not as straightforward as it may at present appear." Outside in the crescent, with the fog thinning to a grey autumnal wash, and the constable's boots audible on the pavement behind us, Lestrade drew alongside Holmes with the expression of a man attempting patience. "Straightforward enough for me," said Lestrade. "Guilt, and a bottle of cyanide, and 20 years of envelopes. It adds up, Mr. Holmes." "Addition," said Holmes pleasantly, turning up his collar against the damp, "is the simplest of the mathematical operations. It is when subtraction is required that difficulties arise." He moved toward the waiting cab. "Come, Watson. There is a great deal yet to observe, and the morning is wasting." I followed, as I had followed for years, into whatever the morning held. Chapter 4. Design rather than passion. Holmes did not return to Baker Street that morning. He directed our cab instead to the corner of Montague Street, dismissed it there, and walked back toward the crescent on foot, hands in pockets, head slightly bowed, in the manner of a man retracing a path he wishes to see differently. I fell into step beside him without comment, long experience having taught me that these ambulatory meditations were neither aimless nor amenable to interruption. We passed the house twice. On the second pass, Holmes stopped before the area railings and looked up at the study window with the concentrated patience of a portrait painter assessing a difficult subject. "The window was opened from within," he said at last. "The outer sill shows no disturbance of any kind, no marking, no residue, nothing that would suggest entry or exit. Whatever passed through that window did so in a more conventional sense." "Air," said I. "Air," he agreed. "And perhaps something carried upon it, or perhaps merely the suggestion of air, the suggestion of a carelessly opened window in a room where everything else was arranged with considerable care." He turned from the house. "Let us go in again." Lestrade was still on the premises, engaged in the production of the considerable quantity of paperwork that violent or suspicious death generates for the official mind. He received us with the slightly resigned affability of a man who has ceased to be surprised by the persistence of Sherlock Holmes, and gave instructions that we were to be admitted wherever we required. Holmes began not in the study but in the corridor outside it, kneeling to examine the carpet runner with his lens, then rising to inspect the door frame, the handle, and finally the door itself, examining both surfaces with minute attention before pushing it open and going in. The study, cleared now of Lestrade's men, and of its principal occupant, had the particular quality of emptiness that rooms acquire after a death within them, as though the air itself has been subtly altered. The dark stain on the desk leather had dried to a dull brownish red. The black-sealed envelope and its contents had been bagged by Lestrade's constable, but Holmes had, with characteristic foresight, secured permission to retain them for examination, and he now laid them upon the desk and bent over them with the attentiveness of a scholar with a newly recovered manuscript. I occupied myself in examining the room more broadly, while Holmes attended to the particular. The bookshelves were undisturbed. The deed boxes, ranged along the upper shelves, were labelled in a neat hand that I took for Montague's own, their contents spanning 4 decades of legal practice. The wastepaper basket beside the desk was empty, which struck me as noteworthy until I recalled that Perkins, the manservant, had confirmed he emptied it each evening as part of his routine. "Watson," said Holmes without looking up, "what is the temperature of this room?" I considered. The fire had not been relit. The window remained as we had found it. "Cold," I said. "Considerably colder than the drawing-room." "Yes. A man who settled in this room before dawn, with the intention of composing himself for an act of self-destruction, would in all probability have laid and lit the fire first. It is October. The ash in the grate is yesterday's, not this morning's." He straightened. "He did not light the fire because he did not anticipate remaining here long. He came down, he opened or found open the envelope, and something occurred. He was quiet for a moment. Or he was brought here, which is a different proposition entirely." He turned his attention to the envelope. Black wax, uncrested, as I observed at Baker Street. "But look here, Watson." He indicated the underside of the wax seal with the tip of his pen. "Do you see the faint graining in the wax surface? That texture is not from the envelope paper. It is the impression of a cloth or similar material pressed briefly against the wax before it fully set. The seal was handled, not merely applied, and handled by someone wearing something over their fingers." "To avoid leaving a print in the wax," I said. "Precisely. And here." He moved to the paper itself, holding it at an angle to the grey light from the window. "The surface of this sheet is not undifferentiated. There is a shadow of impression here and here along the upper half. A letter was written on this sheet, Watson, or on a sheet placed upon it. The paper beneath absorbed a ghost of the pen's pressure." He set it down. The blank sheet was not always blank. I absorbed this in silence. Outside, a cart rumbled through the crescent, and the sound seemed to belong to an entirely different world from the one Holmes and I were presently inhabiting. Then someone removed a letter from the envelope, I said, after Montague had read it. Or replaced the original letter with a blank sheet after Montague had read it. The distinction matters. He moved to the window and examined once more the narrow gap through which the cold air entered. The day was chill. Montague would not have opened this window. Someone else opened it, or it was opened before Montague entered the room. He said no more about the window, but I noticed that he spent some minutes examining the fireplace grate, not the ash within it, but the iron surround and the hearth tiles, before crossing to the wastepaper basket and looking into its empty interior with an attention quite disproportionate to its emptiness. "Perkins empties it each evening," I offered. "He does. At what hour?" He said when I spoke with him, shortly after the household retires, between 10 and 11. So anything deposited in this basket after 10 o'clock last evening would have remained here until morning, and anything deposited before 10 would have been removed. He set down the basket. "We shall need to ask Perkins whether he noticed anything particular in it yesterday evening." We spoke with each member of the household in the library that afternoon, Holmes conducting these conversations with a patience and an apparent casualness that I have always found remarkable, given the precision of what he was actually extracting. He did not approach the matter chronologically or logically in any way his subjects might have anticipated. He asked Mrs. Montague about the garden. He asked Hale about a particular case from the law reports of 1881 that stood upon the study shelves. He asked Bryce about his club, and whether the kitchens there had maintained their former standard. He asked Miss Whitfield about the filing system she employed, and whether Mr. Montague had preferred correspondence to be kept by date or by correspondent. Each answer supplied something. I could see it in the small controlled economy of Holmes's reactions, a fractional stillness here, a barely perceptible shift of attention there. He was building something as a surveyor builds a map, point by careful point. As we prepared to leave, late in the afternoon, I drew alongside him in the entrance hall and spoke quietly. "What have you concluded?" He pulled on his gloves with the methodical deliberateness he applied to all physical actions when his mind was fully occupied. "4 things," he said. "The wax was handled with precaution. The letter was removed. The fire was not laid, and Montague's right glove is missing." I frowned. "His glove?" "He was found in his morning clothes, Watson, both coat and waistcoat. Gloves would be expected in the hall stand or in the coat pockets. There is one right-hand glove in the left coat pocket. Its pair is absent." He opened the front door. "A man dressing before dawn does not mislay a single glove and retain its fellow. Someone took it, and did so after Montague was beyond the point of objection. The fog had returned with the early darkness, thicker than the night before, and the gas lamps in the crescent burned with a muffled, watery light that seemed less to illuminate than to suggest illumination." Holmes stood for a moment on the step, looking out into it. "This was designed, Watson," he said, "not committed in passion or despair, but arranged with deliberation and a very particular understanding of this household and its history. The killer wished Montague to feel, in his final moments, not fear, but the weight of his own conscience. That is not the work of hatred." He descended to the pavement. "It is the work of something considerably more patient." What that something was he didn't yet say, but the word patient seemed to hang in the foggy air of the crescent long after we had walked away through it. Chapter 5. Conscience and Conversation. There are mornings in London when the fog lifts early and the October light falls clean and pale across the city's rooftops, and one feels, however briefly, that the world has been set in tolerable order. The morning after our second visit to the Bloomsbury townhouse was of that variety, and I found it strangely incongruous, stepping out of Baker Street into such clarity, with the details of the preceding day still arranging and rearranging themselves in my mind. Holmes had been up since before dawn. By the time I came down, he had already dispatched 2 telegrams, consumed a quantity of toast that represented for him a considerable appetite, and covered 3 sheets of notepaper in his cramped, angular hand. He did not show me the notes. He rarely did at this stage, when he was still in the process of constructing rather than confirming, and I had long since ceased to take it as anything other than the natural working habit of a mind that preferred to present conclusions whole rather than in the unfinished state. "We shall go to Mrs. Montague first," he said, reaching for his coat. "Alone, if she will receive us. The others need not be present." Mrs. Montague received us in the morning room, a smaller and more personal space than the drawing room in which we had assembled 2 evenings before. She was in black, as was to be expected, and it suited her with the implication that she had always known she would wear it well. She offered tea, which Holmes declined, and coffee, which I accepted, and she settled herself opposite us with the same precise composure she had maintained throughout, though it seemed to me, watching her in this quieter light, that composure was costing her rather more this morning than it had the previous evening. Holmes opened without preamble or consolation, which might appear indelicate but which I have observed to be in practice a considerable kindness to persons of strong character, for whom the social ceremonies of condolence are often more exhausting than the grief itself. "Mrs. Montague," said he, "I should like to speak with you not about your husband's death, but about the trial. I find that the present in matters of this kind is very often best understood by a patient examination of the past." She regarded him steadily. "Which aspect of the trial?" "The evidence that was not presented." The stillness that followed was of the kind that has weight in it. She did not reach for her coffee cup or adjust her posture, or perform any of the small physical acts by which people in difficult conversations manage their discomfort. She simply sat with the question for a moment, as a woman accustomed to sitting with difficult things. "He told you," she said at last. "Mr. Montague indicated that certain mitigating evidence had not been placed before the court," said Holmes carefully. "He did not elaborate. I should find it useful to understand the nature of that evidence." She looked toward the window, where the clean October light fell across the sill. "Whitfield Surveyor reports," she said. "There were 3 of them. 2 supported my husband's client entirely. The third, the most recent, contained findings that were substantially more ambiguous. Alistair chose to build his case on the first 2 and suppressed the third. Suppressed is perhaps too strong a word. It was not produced, it was not technically required. But Whitfield's counsel did not know to ask for it, and Alistair was not obliged in law to furnish it." She turned back to us. "He was within the law. He was not. In the opinion of 1 or 2 people whose opinions he valued, within what the law is intended to serve." "Mr. Hale being among those people," said Holmes. "Frederick was very plain about it. He and Alistair were close in those years, genuinely close, and I think the argument over the Whitfield matter was the beginning of the distance that grew between them. Frederick did not approve. He said so once in my hearing, and it was not a mild expression of disapproval." She paused. "Alistair never referred to it again after the verdict. He was not a man who revisited decisions." "And yet the envelopes revisited it for him," said Holmes. "Yes," she said quietly, "I believe they did." Holmes let the room be still for a moment, in the manner of a man who understands that silence, well placed, is among the most productive instruments available to a conversation. "Your secretary, Miss Whitfield," he said then, in a tone of entirely casual inquiry, "has she been, in your experience, a person of consistent reliability?" "Entirely. She is discreet, intelligent, and thorough. I have had no cause whatsoever to question her conduct." She paused, and something shifted in her expression, not suspicion precisely, but the shadow of a consideration being examined and set carefully aside. "Why do you ask?" "Professional curiosity only," said Holmes pleasantly. "I ask about everyone." He asked perhaps 6 further questions, none of which touched directly upon the central matter. And then thanked her with a genuine courtesy that I have always felt he reserved for persons who have answered him honestly, when they might with some justification have answered him otherwise. We left her to her mourning, and to whatever forms her private grief was taking behind that magnificent composure. Miss Whitfield's room was on the ground floor, adjacent to the library, a practical space fitted with a writing table, 2 filing cabinets, and a good lamp. She was at work when Holmes tapped at the open door, and she looked up with the expression of someone who has been expecting a visit, and has spent some time preparing for it without being certain what the preparation should consist of. Holmes sat in the chair beside her table, uninvited but without impropriety, or in the easy way he had of making his presence in any space feel entirely natural. "Miss Whitfield," he said, I wonder if you might describe for me the nature of the correspondence you handled relating to the Whitfield case. If the shared surname struck her as something Holmes had not noticed, she did not allow the assumption to reach her expression. I typed certain letters relating to the original case files, she said. When Mr. Montague was reviewing the matter some 2 years after the verdict, he was, I believe, considering whether any restitutive action was possible. And was it? He concluded it was not. The verdict stood. The legal position was unambiguous. "You typed those letters," said Holmes. "Did you read them?" A pause so brief that anyone not listening for it would not have heard it. "A secretary necessarily reads what she types, Mr. Holmes." "Of course. And what was your impression of what you read?" She was quiet for rather longer this time. She looked at her hands, which rested flat upon the writing table, and then she looked at Holmes with a directness that was, I felt, something of a concession from a woman who had been exercising very considerable control over what she allowed to be seen. "My impression," she said at last, "was that a man had been gravely wronged, and that the wronging had been done with full knowledge of its likely consequences, by a person in a position of considerable professional advantage over him, and that the letter acknowledging this was being written not out of genuine remorse, but out of a desire to discharge an obligation so that it need not be felt further." She stopped. "That was my impression." "You expressed it with unusual clarity," said Holmes, "for an impression 2 years in the past." "Some things are not difficult to remember," she said. Holmes rose. "One final question, Miss Whitfield. Your family, are they in London?" "My father died some years ago," she said. "I have no other family of consequence." It was precisely the answer Holmes had expected. I could see it in the slight contained quality of his stillness as she said it. He thanked her, and she returned to her work with the deliberate composure of a woman replacing a mask she is briefly permitted to slip. In the corridor outside, I fell into step beside him. He did not speak until we had reached the entrance hall. "Loyalty," he said, almost to himself, repeating the word he had used on the night of our first visit. "Yes, when pressed by injustice, becomes indistinguishable from resentment." He took his hat from the stand. "The question that now interests me, Watson, is not whether she felt it. It is what she did with it." He said it without accusation, almost with sympathy. But I noticed, as we stepped out into the clear October morning, that his jaw was set, and that he walked rather more quickly than the street required. Chapter 6. The Weight of Silence. We lunched that day at a chop house in Holborn that Holmes favoured less for its cooking, which was serviceable rather than distinguished, than for the reliable privacy of its corner booths, where a conversation of some delicacy could be conducted without concern for adjacent ears. He ate sparingly, as he always did when a case was occupying his full faculties, and spent a portion of the meal turning a small evidence envelope between his fingers, the kind he carried habitually in his coat pocket, for the collection of material too minute for conventional handling. "I intend to call on Hale this afternoon," he said, setting the envelope aside and applying himself briefly to his cutlet. "Alone, I think, or rather, without you in the room. Your presence reassures people, Watson, which is generally an advantage, but with Hale I suspect reassurance is precisely what he does not require." "You wish him uncomfortable," I said. "I wish him honest, which for Frederick Hale may amount to the same thing. He is a man who has spent 30 years constructing a position of moral rectitude from which to view a decision he was party to, however peripherally, and which has not sat entirely easily with him since. A man in that position is most forthcoming when he feels the ground beneath it shifting." He drank his coffee. "You might, while I speak with Hale, take Bryce somewhere congenial and ask him about his finances." I looked up. "His finances?" "In whatever conversational register seems most natural. I do not suggest a direct inquiry. Bryce is a man who enjoys being drawn out on subjects he considers himself knowledgeable about. His clothes are of better quality than his circumstances, I think, would easily support. There is a watch chain, but no watch. The signet ring is genuine, but the cufflinks are paste. He is maintaining an appearance at some cost." Holmes reached for his hat. Whether that cost has any bearing on the matter before us, I cannot yet say. But I find it suggestive that a man of reduced means should be residing, apparently indefinitely, as a guest in the house of a prosperous cousin. We returned to Bloomsbury together, parting in the entrance hall by prior arrangement. I found Bryce in the sitting room at the rear of the house, engaged with a newspaper and an air of enforced leisure that sat upon him rather uneasily, like a coat borrowed from a smaller man. He received my company with the relieved warmth of someone who has been alone with their thoughts and found the experience unwelcome. I will not set down the precise architecture of the conversation that followed, which was, in any case, less a conversation than a gradual excavation conducted beneath the surface of an exchange about horse racing, the membership criteria of certain clubs, and the general difficulty of maintaining a reasonable standard of life in London upon what he described, with careful vagueness, as a variable income. What emerged over the course of an hour was this. Bryce had been, until recently, a partner in a small investment firm in the city, which had not prospered, and from which he had withdrawn his interest at a loss he declined to quantify, but which his expression quantified readily enough. He had come to stay with Montague 6 months prior, he said, while he considered his options. He spoke of Montague with a warmth that was genuine enough, and of the household generally with the particular fondness of a man who has discovered in it a stability absent from his own affairs. When I asked carefully and with all the obliqueness at my disposal whether Montague had been of practical assistance during this difficult period, Bryce's expression underwent a change that he managed with credit, but not quite with the speed that complete comfort would have allowed. Alistair was generous, he said. He was always generous. It was one of his better qualities. He turned a page of the newspaper he had quite forgotten he was holding. One of several. Holmes was emerging from the library as I crossed the entrance hall on my way to report this exchange. He held the door for me without comment, and we went out together into the mild afternoon. Hale, said Holmes, once we were clear of the house, is a more complex figure than he presents. He spoke at some length about legal ethics, as men of uneasy conscience are inclined to do when given sufficient audience. Yet he opposed Montague's tactics in the Whitfield trial, as we knew. What we did not know is that his opposition was not merely verbal. He told me, with a measure of self-satisfaction he was unable entirely to conceal, that he committed his objections to writing at the time, a formal letter addressed to Montague, dated and retained. That is significant, I said. Significant and very convenient, said Holmes. A written objection is the most durable form of moral self-protection known to the legal profession. If the matter were ever to become public, Hale's letter would establish beyond question that he had acted with scruple. He paused at the corner of the crescent. He also told me, without quite appearing to intend to, that he had known of the envelopes from the beginning. Montague told him within a day of receiving the first one. 11 years ago, I considered this. So Hale knew the nature of the threat, or whatever one wishes to call it, for the duration. For the entire duration. He advised Montague to disregard them. He said, with the calm certainty of a man rehearsing a conclusion he reached long ago, that no blackmailer who intended to act would confine himself to blank paper for a decade. Holmes's voice was measured and without obvious inflection, but there was beneath it the quality of a man stating something whose implications he is still examining. He was, of course, correct in the letter of that assessment. The envelopes were not blackmail, but Hale's certainty on that point is interesting in a man who claims to have been as perplexed by them as everyone else. You think he knew more than he has said? I think he knew at least one thing that he has chosen to present as inference rather than knowledge. He stopped walking and turned to face me directly, which he did not always do when delivering a material observation. The ink on the blank sheet, Watson. I examined it last evening under strong light with the lens. It is smudged in one corner, as though a thumb was pressed there while the ink was not quite fully dry. The smudge has a partial pattern. I have not yet been able to identify it conclusively. A thumbprint, possibly, or the edge of a gloved thumb which would account for its incompleteness. He resumed walking. And there is this. He produced from his coat pocket the small evidence envelope he had been turning over at lunch and opened it for my inspection. Within, barely visible against the white paper lining, was a small irregular fragment of black substance, matte in finish and granular in texture. Wax, I said. Black wax. Taken from the exterior sill of the study window, which I examined during our first visit this morning, and to which I returned briefly this afternoon. It was adhering to a small roughness in the stone, at a height consistent with an object resting upon the sill rather than being drawn across it. He resealed the envelope. Black wax of a composition slightly different from that of the envelope seal itself. The seal wax is denser and more lustrous. This fragment is closer in character to the wax of a cheaper variety of taper. Someone stood at the window with a candle, I said. Someone stood at the window. The candle is my inference, not my evidence. He pocketed the envelope. But the soot, Watson. The soot embedded in this fragment does not match the coal ash in any of the household grates I examined. It is wood smoke, and there is not a wood fire in that house. He offered no further elaboration, and I did not press for any. There was something in his manner that afternoon, a quality of deliberate restraint, as though he were pacing himself against a conclusion that was assembling itself faster than the evidence to support it had yet fully accumulated. Back at Baker Street that evening over cold supper and pipes, he sat for a long while in silence before speaking. Someone wished the man to confront not words but memory, he said at last, as though concluding an argument he had been conducting internally throughout the meal. The blank sheet was not an omission, Watson. It was a statement. The letter that once occupied that envelope said what needed to be said, and was then removed, because what mattered was not that Montague should be found with an accusation in his hand, but that he should feel, in his final conscious moments, the full and particular weight of what he had done. He set down his pipe. That is not the design of a murderer. That is the design of a judge. The fire settled in the grate. Outside, Baker Street went about its evening commerce, indifferent as always to the questions being turned over above it. And Mr. Hale, I said quietly. Mr. Hale, said Holmes, is a man who has given a great deal of thought to justice, and rather less to mercy. He rose and moved to the window. We shall see what the morning brings. Chapter 7. The Comfortable Explanation. Lestrade arrived at Baker Street the following morning in the self-possessed manner of a man bearing good news, which is to say he arrived more quickly than the stairs strictly required, and sat down without being invited. He accepted Mrs. Hudson's coffee with the enthusiasm of someone who's been at Scotland Yard since before the city was properly awake, and produced from his coat a folded document which he laid upon the table between himself and Holmes, with the gesture of a card player revealing a hand he considers unbeatable. There it is, said he, signed by the divisional surgeon this morning, cyanide poisoning, self-administered. The coroner will hear it Thursday, but I don't anticipate any difficulty. Holmes, who had been standing at the mantelpiece, descended sufficiently to glance at the document without taking it up. Your evidence for self-administration, he said, with a courtesy that gave nothing away. The cyanide was in a locked cabinet of which only Montague held the key. No forced entry to the house or the study. No physical evidence of another person present. Every member of the household accounted for during the relevant hours. Lestrade counted these off upon his fingers with the satisfaction of a man to whom arithmetic comes naturally. And motive, Mr. Holmes? The man had been receiving those envelopes for 11 years. That sort of persistent reminder of one's worst moment has a cumulative effect. The surgeon is of the view that prolonged guilt of this character can produce, in susceptible individuals, a final crisis. The surgeon is very obliging, said Holmes. Lestrade's eyes narrowed very slightly, which for Lestrade represented considerable expressiveness. You have an objection? Several. But I am interested for the moment in the financial records you mentioned. Examined thoroughly, no immediate beneficiary. Montague's estate goes to Mrs. Montague in the first instance, with provisions for certain charities and a modest bequest to the household staff. Nothing that creates an obvious motive for murder, if that is what you're working toward." He retrieved his document and folded it with the neat finality of a man closing a chapter. "I know your methods, Mr. Holmes, and I respect them more than perhaps I'm always prompt to say. But in this instance the evidence points in one direction only, and the direction is not complicated." Holmes moved to the window and looked out upon Baker Street for a moment before turning. "The decanter, Lestrade. You have mentioned the decanter. I mentioned it again because it continues to merit mention. A man who pours what he intends to be his final drink does not replace the stopper. The act is pointless. It implies a return to the decanter that he has no intention of making." "Men do habitual things," said Lestrade. "You have said it yourself." "I have said that men do habitual things under habitual circumstances. A man departing life permanently is not operating under habitual circumstances." Holmes settled into his chair. "But pray continue." "I should like to hear the complete theory." It was not an invitation that contained warmth, but Lestrade, to his credit, was not easily discouraged in possession of a theory. He set out his reconstruction with commendable clarity. Montague, he proposed, had over the past weeks reached the end of some internal calculus of guilt. He had obtained the cyanide, perhaps weeks in advance, keeping it in the locked cabinet against a moment of final resolution. On the morning in question he had descended early, opened the most recent envelope, read the blank sheet, which Lestrade characterized as a final empty mockery, and been precipitated by this last indignity into action. He had poured his port, dissolved the cyanide, and drunk. The glass had shattered in the convulsion that followed. Death had supervened within minutes. It was, as Holmes had said the previous evening of a different kind of reasoning, a thoroughly comfortable explanation. I could see that it would satisfy a coroner. I could see that it satisfied Lestrade in every faculty he chose to bring to the question. And I could see, with equal clarity, that it satisfied Holmes not at all. The household, when we arrived that afternoon, had undergone the subtle transformation that a death 3 days old produces in those living within its proximity. The acute and stunned quality of the first day had given way to something more settled, a cautious, tentative resumption of ordinary motion, as though each person were testing the floor after an unexpected subsidence to establish which boards might still be trusted. Mrs. Hudson had draped certain mirrors, as custom required. The study remained sealed at Holmes's request, a request that Lestrade had granted with diminishing patience. Mrs. Montague wept when Lestrade's conclusion was communicated to her, which he did in the drawing-room with the assembled household present. It was the first visible dissolution of her composure I had witnessed, and it was brief, contained within a handkerchief pressed to her mouth for perhaps 10 seconds, after which she straightened and received Lestrade's expression of official sympathy with a dignity that seemed, in her, a condition of existence rather than a performance. Miss Whitfield grew pale at the word suicide, a paleness that went beyond the ordinary blanching of the complexion and reached something further in, some deeper level of disturbance that a physician's eye registers rather than interprets. She did not speak. She sat entirely still in her chair by the writing table, and looked at a point somewhat beyond Lestrade's left shoulder, as a person does when they are hearing something they are simultaneously attempting to process and resist. Hale received the conclusion with the measured satisfaction of a man who has been told that the discomfort he has been feeling is not, in fact, a symptom of anything serious. He spoke of the tragedy of it in terms that were dignified and appropriately subdued, and offered the view that a man of Montague's fundamental quality, whatever his professional errors, deserved a charitable interpretation of his final act. The speech had the ring of one mentally composed in advance and delivered upon cue. Bryce said very little, which was for him the most remarkable response of all. He sat upon the sofa and turned his signet ring and looked at the floor. Holmes alone said nothing throughout this proceeding. He sat in the corner armchair, his chin resting upon his hand, and watched the room with the quality of attention I have come to recognize as his most intense. Not restless, not roving, but of an absolute and rather unnerving stillness, like a man at a window watching something approach from a very great distance. When Lestrade had gone, and the household had dispersed, and the drawing-room was empty save for myself and Holmes, I asked him directly, "Well, does Lestrade's version satisfy you any better now than it did this morning?" "Less," said Holmes, rising and moving to the mantelpiece, even where he stood with his back to the room in the attitude of private consultation with whatever internal faculty he most relied upon. "The household accepted it, Watson. Did you observe how they accepted it?" "With relief," I said. "Yes, but relief of differing qualities." He turned. Mrs. Montague's relief was the relief of a woman spared a worse conclusion. Whatever she feared, Lestrade's verdict is preferable to it. Hale's relief was the relief of a man who has seen a door he hoped would remain closed, apparently locked from the outside. He paused. And Miss Whitfield's was not relief at all. What she felt when Lestrade pronounced his verdict was not comfort. It was something closer to distress. "'Cause she knows it is wrong," I said slowly. "'Cause she knows it is wrong," Holmes agreed. "Or because it absolves someone who ought not to be absolved." He was quiet for a moment. "And there is something she has not told us, Watson. Something she calculated during the interview yesterday and decided to retain. I could see the calculation. I did not yet have the materials to complete it from the outside." He crossed to the writing table and stood looking at it, not touching anything, simply looking, in the manner of someone reviewing a conversation that has concluded unsatisfactorily and determining where the error of approach was made. "I am not yet satisfied," he said, with a quietness that was more absolute than any emphasis, "and I am not yet finished. Tomorrow morning I shall go back to the study, and I shall go alone at first light before the house is stirring." He picked up his hat from the table. "There is something there that we have not yet seen, Watson, because we have not yet known precisely where to look for it. I believe I know now." He did not elaborate, and the question I wished to ask dissolved, as questions so often did in Holmes's company, into the understanding that the answer, when it came, would be more complete and more worth waiting for than anything I could extract by pressing. I followed him out into the darkening afternoon with the particular feeling, familiar from 100 cases, that the ground was about to shift significantly beneath us all. Chapter 8. The Overlooked Detail. Holmes was gone before I rose that morning. I found evidence of him in the sitting room in the form of a cold cup of tea, a pipe recently extinguished, and a note upon the mantelpiece in his angular hand that read simply, "Gone to Bloomsbury. Do not come before 9. It was 7:15. I ate breakfast alone, read the morning papers without retaining much of their contents, and arrived in Russell Square at 5 minutes to 9 to find Holmes already on the pavement outside the house, his coat damp with the morning's thin drizzle, his expression carrying that particular quality of compressed energy that I associate with the period immediately following a significant discovery. He said nothing by way of greeting, but turned and led me directly inside and through the entrance hall to the study door, which he unlocked with a key Lestrade had evidently entrusted to him. The room was cold and very still, the air carrying the staleness of several days' closure overlaid with the faint chemical residue that had not entirely dispersed. The curtains were drawn back, admitting the grey morning light, which lay flat and unsparing across every surface. Holmes had been at work for some time. This was apparent from the small, orderly arrangements he had made. 3 objects placed in a line upon the corner of the desk, the lens set beside them, and the studying chair positioned at an angle that suggested it had been moved deliberately to a particular vantage point, and then forgotten in the way that objects used in earnest application are forgotten. "The fireplace first," he said, crossing to the grate with the brisk purposefulness of a man returning to something he has temporarily set aside rather than leading someone to something new. "I examined the ash 2 days ago and found it unremarkable. This morning I examined the iron back plate and the interior walls of the chimney breast." He crouched and directed my attention with a gesture that was almost economical in its precision. "There," I crouched beside him. Set into the gathering of ash and soot along the lower left interior of the grate Half concealed by a fallen fragment of charred wood that had not been fully consumed, was the corner of something that had once been paper and was now almost entirely reduced to fragile black tissue. Almost entirely, but not quite. A portion of perhaps 2 inches along one edge retained sufficient integrity to be distinguishable as paper rather than ash, and along that edge, just legible in the improved light of Holmes's small lantern, were 3 letters of a word, the letters T, or H and E, in a hand I recognised from 2 days of visiting as belonging to someone in that household. It was burned, I said. Burned hastily and under some pressure of time, Holmes said, rising. A document consigned to a fire that has been burning steadily reduces to an even ash within minutes. This was fed into a cold or dying fire by someone who could not wait for the fire to be properly built up, and then the process was interrupted, or the person was required to leave before the destruction was complete. He moved to the desk, which tells us 2 things. First, the document was destroyed here, in this room, on the morning of Montague's death, or immediately thereafter. Second, and the person who destroyed it was operating under constraint of time. He directed my attention to the first of the 3 objects arranged on the desk corner. It was a sliver of dark material, barely a centimetre in length, curved slightly at one edge. From the wastepaper basket, he said, caught in the wicker weave at the base. Perkins empties the basket by inverting it and shaking, which is efficient enough for paper, but insufficient for objects that have worked their way into the weave itself. He handed me the lens. Under magnification, the material resolved itself clearly. It was leather, thin and fine, of the variety used for the inner lining of a quality glove. The missing glove, I said. The missing right-hand glove, or more precisely, a fragment of its inner lining, torn away in the act of removing the glove quickly and with some force. A person pulling a glove from their hand in haste will sometimes catch the inner seam against a ring, or simply against the resistance of the leather itself and tear the lining. He set the lens down. Montague's own gloves, which I examined when we first arrived, have both linings intact. This fragment did not come from his gloves. It came from the gloves of whoever was last in this room with him. I looked at the remaining 2 objects on the desk. The second was a short length of thread, dark blue in colour, of a quality that suggested a heavier garment, a coat or a dressing gown. The third was so small that I had to look twice before I could identify it at all. A tiny flake of black wax, distinct from the larger fragment Holmes had retrieved from the windowsill. This one taken, as he confirmed, from the carpet immediately beneath the writing chair. The wax fragments, I said, both the sill and the floor. Different locations, different moments. The sill fragment was deposited from outside, or from the inner sill used as a resting surface in poor light, hence the taper. The floor fragment was deposited by someone carrying an object that still bore a trace of wax, most probably in a coat pocket. The wax transferred to the carpet when the person stood or knelt near the chair. He sat in the writing chair and looked at the desk surface with the expression of someone reading a text that others have found blank. Now, the envelope. He drew from his inside pocket a sheet of paper, which I recognised as a careful tracing he'd made. By laying thin paper over the blank sheet and working the pencil across it, at an oblique angle of the impression left by the original letter. It was not fully legible, the impression being inconsistent and partially overlaid by the grain of the paper, but certain elements were clear. A date at the top, the word father in the body of the text, and toward what appeared to be the conclusion, the letters of a name that ran to 7 characters, of which 3 were recoverable with confidence. Enough to confirm the authorship, given what we already know, Holmes said quietly. Not enough to constitute proof in isolation, but combined with everything else, more than sufficient. He rose from the chair and stood for a moment in the centre of the room, looking at it in the comprehensive way a painter looks at a finished canvas, satisfying himself that nothing has been omitted. The letter was written by Miss Clara Whitfield, he said, in the tone of a man stating something he has long since ceased to find speculative. It was placed in the envelope and delivered with the others, all of which she also sent over 11 years, each blank sheet a year's patience, a year's accumulated intention, leading to this final year's letter, in which she laid before Montague the complete truth of who she was and what he had done to her father. He crossed to the window. Montague read it. The shock of it, the undeniable specificity of it, was sufficient to precipitate a crisis, a seizure perhaps, or a collapse of the kind that a man of his age and constitution, under extreme emotional shock, is not well placed to survive. "He died of it," I said slowly. "Ah, before any poison." "That is what I believe." And Frederick Hale, who was in this room either when it occurred or immediately thereafter, understood at once what the letter meant and what its discovery would bring upon himself. He administered the cyanide to a man already dead or dying. He removed the letter. He burned it imperfectly in the grate and pocketed the remaining evidence he could find. Holmes turned from the window, and he left one glove's lining in the wastepaper basket, a scrap of blue thread on the carpet, and a flake of wax beneath the writing chair. He said it without bitterness, almost without inflection. "Men in a hurry leave traces, Watson. It is one of the few reliable constants of this work." I sat down, finding that the completion of this architecture of evidence had the effect, not of resolution, but of a peculiar weight. A woman who had sought only truth, a man who had destroyed it, and between them, the long-dead figure of a ruined surveyor who had never been given back what had been taken from him. "What do we do now?" I asked. Holmes picked up his hat. "Now," he said, "we gather everyone together, and I explain what this room has been trying to tell us since the morning we first walked into it. Chapter 9. The Truth Revealed." Holmes sent a note to Lestrade before we left the study, brief and unambiguous, requesting his presence at the Bloomsbury house at 2 o'clock that afternoon, upon a matter that would require his official authority. To the household he said nothing of his intentions, asking only through Perkins that all members remain at home until that hour. If this request communicated something of what was coming, Holmes evidently judged it preferable that it should. A man who has something to answer for and is given the morning to consider the shape of his answers is, in Holmes's experience, frequently better prepared to be honest than one who is surprised into defence. We returned to Baker Street, and Holmes spent the intervening hours in his armchair in a state of such thorough inward occupation that I ceased after a time to offer conversation, and contented myself with correspondence and the occasional replenishment of the fire. Once he rose to consult something in his index. Once he stood at the window for 5 minutes, watching the street below with an expression that was not quite abstraction, and not quite resolution, but something part way between the two. At 1:30 he rose, put on his coat without comment, and we walked to Bloomsbury through the damp October streets, in a silence that felt, to me at any rate, rather like the silence before a verdict is read. Lestrade was already there when we arrived, standing in the entrance hall with the expression of a man who considers his morning's work completed and cannot entirely account for why he has been summoned to revisit it. The household was assembled in the drawing-room, Mrs. Montague in her chair by the fire, as though she had not moved since we first encountered her. Hale at the window in his habitual position, his broad back to the room, Bryce upon the sofa making a rather more deliberate effort than usual to appear relaxed, and Miss Whitfield at the writing table, her hands folded before her, yet her face composed with a precision that I now recognised as the outward expression of an inward act of considerable will. Holmes stood before the fireplace and addressed them without preamble. "I am grateful to you all for remaining," he said. "What I have to set out this afternoon will be uncomfortable, and I ask you to permit me to complete it before you respond to any part of it. When I have finished, you will each have the opportunity to say whatever you wish to say." There was no visible response from anyone. The room received this with the particular quality of stillness that precedes something unavoidable. "The death of Mr. Alistair Montague," Holmes began, "was not suicide. The evidence presented in support of that conclusion, the locked cabinet, the absence of forced entry, the accessible motive, harm was circumstantially persuasive but physically inconsistent. A corked decanter, an unlit fire, a missing glove. These are not the accompaniments of a man who acted alone in his final hour. He paused, looking not at the room generally, but at particular faces in a sequence that I understood as deliberate. 11 years ago, a series of black-sealed envelopes began arriving at this address on the 14th of October, the anniversary of the verdict in the Whitfield case. Each contained a blank sheet of paper. The envelopes were not a threat and not a demand. They were a marking of time, a private calendar kept by someone for whom that date carried a significance that did not diminish with the passing years but accumulated. He looked at Miss Whitfield. They were sent by you, Miss Whitfield, or rather, by Miss Clara Whitfield, a daughter of James Whitfield, surveyor, who was ruined by the conduct of this case 20 years ago and dead within 5 years of its conclusion. The room was entirely still. Miss Whitfield did not look away. You entered this household 3 years ago under your own name, Holmes continued, which is a detail worth remarking upon. You did not assume a false identity. You relied upon the fact that your father's name, though known to Montague as a professional adversary, would not be associated by him with the secretary of your generation and position, a reliance that proved entirely correct. He moved slightly, not with agitation, but with the deliberate economy of a man marking a transition in his account. You sent 10 blank sheets over 10 years. The blank paper was not emptiness, it was the opposite of emptiness. It was everything you had not yet said, held in reserve, compounding in weight with each successive year. Hale turned from the window. His face was red, his expression controlled, but something in his jaw had set in a way that suggested the control was being maintained by active effort. This year's envelope contained a letter, Holmes said. You had decided that the time for silence had passed. The letter set out, with specificity and with documentation derived from your father's own papers, the precise nature of Montague's suppression of the third surveyor's report. It named the report, its date, its findings, and the decision taken to exclude it. It established, beyond any reasonable private doubt, that Montague had known exactly what he was doing, and had done it regardless. He turned to the room more broadly. Montague came down early on the morning of his death. He opened the envelope which had been delivered the previous evening, and he read your letter, Miss Whitfield, in this study, alone, in the cold. What the letter represented to him was not merely accusation. It was undeniable confirmation, in his 72nd year, by the daughter of the man he had ruined, that the one act of his professional life about which he had been unable to achieve lasting comfort had been precisely as culpable as his conscience had always privately insisted. Holmes paused. The shock of it, specific and irrefutable after decades of self-managed doubt, was more than his constitution could absorb. He suffered a catastrophic seizure. He was likely dead, or insensible beyond recovery, within minutes of laying down that letter. In the chair by the fire, Mrs. Montague pressed her handkerchief to her mouth. It was not the brief controlled gesture of 3 days ago. This was something different. The posture of a woman receiving a truth she had half known and wholly dreaded. The letter, Holmes continued, his voice carrying no rise in its register, was then removed from the study and from the envelope by someone who understood at once what its discovery would mean, not merely for the reputation of Alistair Montague, which was beyond earthly preservation by that point, but for the reputation and the legal exposure of Frederick Hale. Hale took one step forward from the window. "I must protest," he said. "You will have your opportunity," said Holmes, with a courtesy that was also an instruction. The letter named Hale. I cannot read the full impression the original made upon the blank sheet beneath it, but I can read enough. Your name appears in its final passages, Mr. Hale, in connection with the written objection you submitted to Montague at the time of the trial, an objection which established your awareness of the suppression, and which, seen in the light of Miss Whitfield's letter, would raise with uncomfortable precision the question of what further steps a man of genuine scruple might have been expected to take beyond committing a private objection to paper. Hale's colour had deepened. He said nothing. "You administered the cyanide from the cabinet after Montague was beyond resistance," Holmes said. "You burned the letter in the grate imperfectly, in a fire that had not been built up sufficiently for the purpose. You took the remnants of the envelope from the desk. You replaced the blank sheet. You pocketed the glove that Montague had been wearing against the morning cold, because it bore a trace of the letter in its folds, and you left behind, in your haste, a fragment of your own glove lining in the wastepaper basket, a thread from your dressing gown upon the carpet, and a flake of the wax from the taper you carried from your room upon the floor beneath the writing chair." The silence was absolute. "You did not act for gain," Holmes said. "There is, I think, a measure of honesty in acknowledging that. You acted to preserve the firm's reputation, your own carefully maintained rectitude, and the peace of a household you had lived within, at varying degrees of proximity for 30 years. You acted, as men of your particular formation sometimes do, for the sake of an order of things that you have concluded is worth protecting at almost any cost." He looked at Hale steadily. "The difficulty is that the cost in this instance was a human life." Hale stood for a long moment. The room waited. Then, with the deliberateness of a man who has decided that a certain kind of resistance is no longer tenable, he sat down heavily in the nearest chair. "The letter," he said, his voice flattened to something barely above a monotone, "would have destroyed everything. Not merely Alistair, the firm, the clients, everything we built." He looked at his hands. He was already gone. I could see that. There was nothing to be done for him. "And yet something remained to be done to him," said Lestrade, who had been silent throughout with an expression of concentrated attention I had rarely seen on his face, and who now crossed the room with the quiet authority of the official machinery of justice resuming its proper function. Miss Whitfield rose from her chair at the writing table. She looked at Hale with an expression I have encountered perhaps twice in my professional life, on the faces of persons who have pursued something through great difficulty and arrived at its end to find that the arrival brings not satisfaction but a kind of exhausted clarity. "I sought confession," she said, "to no one in particular, or perhaps to her father's memory. Not this." Holmes said nothing. There are moments in which silence is not absence but the most precise response available, and he had always understood them. Lestrade placed his hand upon Hale's shoulder, and the matter in its official dimension was concluded. Chapter 10. The Balance of Justice. Frederick Hale was taken from the house in Russell Square that afternoon with the quiet efficiency that Lestrade, whatever his limitations as a theorist, invariably brought to the practical management of an arrest. There was no scene. Hale had the self-possession of a man who, having made a decision of the most irrevocable kind, has arrived at a further decision to conduct himself with dignity through its consequences. He asked for his coat, which Perkins brought. He put it on with care. He didn't look at Mrs. Montague as he passed through the drawing-room, nor at Miss Whitfield, nor at Bryce, who stood by the mantelpiece with the expression of a man witnessing something he will spend considerable time attempting to assimilate. He looked briefly at Holmes, and Holmes met the look without expression and without turning away. There are partings in these cases that carry their own specific gravity, and that one was of the kind. I remained at the house for another hour, attending to Mrs. Montague, who had entered a state that was not collapse, but was close enough to its borders to require a physician's assessment rather than a sympathetic layman's. She was, in my professional view, in reasonable physical health, and what she was experiencing was the particular exhaustion of a woman who has maintained extraordinary composure through several days of compounded shock, and has at last been given, by the resolution of uncertainty, a permission to feel the full weight of what has occurred. I left her in the care of a sensible housemaid, wrote a brief note for her own doctor recommending rest and a mild restorative, and made my way to the entrance hall. Miss Whitfield was there, dressed for outdoors, her hat on and her gloves in her hand, standing at the foot of the stairs with the composed and self-contained air of a person who has concluded a chapter of their life and is not yet certain what the next page holds. Holmes stood near the door, and they were speaking in quiet voices. I hesitated at the foot of the stairs, but Holmes glanced at me with the slight inclination of the head that indicated I was not intruding, and I joined them. "I shall not press civil claims," Miss Whitfield was saying, with a steadiness that struck me as the product not of indifference, but of a long and very careful consideration. "The exposure of the truth is sufficient. It is what my father deserved, and it is what I came here to secure." She paused. "I had not intended that anyone should die for it." "I know that," Holmes said simply. "The letter was meant to produce a confession, a private admission, perhaps a statement for the record, something that would restore his name, my father's name, in whatever way such things can be restored posthumously." She drew on her gloves, the gesture automatic, a woman returning to the ordinary mechanics of existence. I did not anticipate that the truth, after 20 years, would be more than he could physically bear. "Few of us," said Holmes, "correctly anticipate the weight of a thing we have never had to carry ourselves." She looked at him for a moment. Then she offered her hand, which Holmes took briefly. She nodded to me, and she left. The door closed behind her with a quietness entirely disproportionate to what it concluded. We walked back to Baker Street through the late afternoon, the streets taking on the amber quality that London acquires in autumn, when the light is going and the lamplighters are not yet at their work. Holmes did not speak for the better part of the journey, which I understood as the particular silence of a man engaged in the final stages of an intellectual process that has no further use for external input. I had shared enough of these walks to know that what emerged from them, if one waited with patience, was invariably worth the waiting. So it was not until we were settled again in the Baker Street sitting room, the fire rebuilt, the lamps lit, and Mrs. Hudson's supper cooling gently on the tray between us, that Holmes spoke at any length. "The law will deal with Hale," he said, pushing his plate aside and reaching for his pipe. "Murder, in the eyes of the court, is murder. The precise condition of the victim at the moment of administration is a matter for the jury's deliberation, but I do not anticipate an acquittal. Whatever sympathy a judge may feel for the complications of the situation, cyanide introduced into the glass of a helpless man is not amenable to comfortable interpretation." "And Montague himself," I said, settling back in my chair, "his original transgression." "The suppressed report." "Lies entirely beyond the reach of any court that now exists," said Holmes, striking a match and applying it with the methodical patience he brought to tobacco. "That is the condition of his kind of wrong. It was committed within the law, punished only by conscience, and the conscience, it seems, was less reliable a corrective than Miss Whitfield's 11 years of blank paper." He drew on the pipe and looked at the fire. 20 years of a man's professional life, Watson, decorated with good works and charitable endowments, spoken of with respect in the Inns of Court, attended by a wife of dignity and a household of reasonable contentment, and beneath all of it, one act, not even dramatic in its commission, merely the decision not to produce a document that he could not finally escape. He did try. In his way, I offered. Mrs. Montague said he considered restitutive action. "He considered it," Holmes agreed. "Consideration without action is the particular province of men who have more comfort to lose than conscience to spend. The consideration cost him nothing. The action would have cost him a great deal. He chose accordingly, and then lived for 20 years with the cost of the choice he declined to make." He was quiet for a moment. Miss Whitfield understood this with a precision that 20 years of observation of her father's ruin had furnished her. She did not send him a demand because she did not want his money. She did not send him an accusation because she did not want his punishment. She sent him, year after year, the one thing most calculated to make him feel the specific quality of his own failure. "Nothing," I said, or silence, which is not nothing. Silence, Watson, has texture and weight when it is the silence of someone who knows exactly what you did and has chosen, so far, not to speak of it. That is among the most refined forms of pressure a human being can exert upon the conscience of another. He smoked for a while, the fire doing its quiet work in the grate, the street below carrying on its indifferent evening commerce of cabs and footsteps, and the distant calling of a late newspaper vendor. "What troubled you most about it?" I asked. It was the kind of question I rarely put to Holmes, knowing that he found the hierarchy of his own responses less interesting than the hierarchy of evidence. But the evening had a reflective quality that seemed to invite it. He considered the question with evident seriousness. "That Hale was not wrong," he said at last, "in the narrowest possible sense. He correctly identified that Miss Whitfield's letter, produced in evidence, would have destroyed a great deal that was not, in itself, deserving of destruction. The clients, the staff, persons entirely uninvolved in the original wrong. He made a calculation, as men of that formation do, and he made it quickly, as the circumstances required." He set down the pipe. "What he could not see, or would not, is that a calculation made with perfect logic from imperfect premises will arrive at a conclusion that is technically sound and morally indefensible. He weighed reputation against truth, and found reputation the heavier, which is the oldest and most persistent error in the history of powerful men." "And Miss Whitfield," I said quietly. "What becomes of her?" Holmes looked toward the window where the London dark had settled completely now, and the gas lamps made their patient circles of light in it. "She is free," he said, with a simplicity that I found, coming from him, unexpectedly moving. Whatever that means for a woman who has spent 11 years in service to a single purpose. I imagine she will require some time to discover what it means. Most people do, when a long preoccupation is lifted. I thought of her gloved hands at the foot of those stairs, the careful composure, the door closing behind her with its quiet final sound. I thought of James Whitfield, the surveyor, ruined by a document that a more scrupulous man would have produced, dead before his daughter was grown to the age at which she could act upon what she knew. I thought of Montague reading that letter in the cold unlit study, in the early dark of an October morning, and of whatever it was he felt in those final moments. Whether it was the specific release of a burden long carried, or simply the accumulated weight of it arriving all at once. I did not say any of this aloud. There are reflections that belong to the private interior of an evening rather than to conversation, and Holmes, who was looking at the fire with the composed attention of a man who has closed a volume and is considering it from a slight distance, seemed to understand this without being told. "The Black Seal," he said after a while, "was not a mark of threat, my dear Watson. It was a mark of mourning. It sealed not merely a letter, but 20 years of unspoken guilt. 11 envelopes, 11 silences, each one saying, with perfect economy, everything that words would have been insufficient to convey." He rose and moved to the mantelpiece. Miss Whitfield was a most exact correspondent. It was said with something that was not quite admiration, and not quite sorrow, but occupied the quiet space between the two. I've recorded many of Holmes's conclusions over our long association, some of them brilliant in the conventional sense, some of them merely right, which is a different and perhaps more durable quality. This one I set down here because it seems to me to contain within it something that the law, which took Hale and will do its appointed work upon him, cannot quite reach. The recognition that justice, when it arrives after a very long time, does not restore what was lost. It merely illuminates, with a cold and clarifying light, the precise dimensions of the loss. I noted it as Watson the physician and Watson the chronicler, and I closed my notebook upon it, and the fire went on burning, and Baker Street went on below us, and the evening passed as evenings do, carrying everything in it that evenings carry, which is to say more than can comfortably be examined, and less than we would wish.